Since this panel is about regulation, I thought there's nothing better than to speak about the flavor of this coming month, which is the G20. The group of 20 nations, as many of you would be familiar, has been elevated from the original ranks of a second-tier finance ministers level of intergovernmental organization or institution to a heads of state summit level institution since the spectacular crash of 9/15/2008. As we know, the old maxim of necessity being the mother of invention, many people understood the new reincarnation of G20 as the steering mechanism for bailing the world out of the worst crisis since the 1930s. Many people interpreted it as purely driven by the crisis, and it certainly was the timing. The first G20 summit, heads of state summit, occurred just weeks after it became clear that we are on the verge of a major global economic crisis. So, need answered by invention. That is certainly one way of looking at it. And there's, of course, a deeper reason for the formulation of this unique North-South institution that combines or brings together for the first time all the quote-unquote major economies of the world, some of which are from the global north and some from the global south. This is, of course, what I mean by the realization that all the levers of the global economy are no longer in the hands of the G7, which predates the G20. So, structural change in economic power configuration of the world was the ultimate cause for G20's creation. The trigger, the immediate cause, was the financial crisis. I'm going to come back to the difference between ultimate cause and immediate cause as we look at the short view and the long view of the future of G20 as a problem-solving international institution and the centerpiece of global economic governance. So, the short view, as I said, is utilitarian, and that G20 is a crisis-fighting mechanism, and nothing more than that. And here, people would then automatically deduce, once there's no longer any crisis, there's no longer a need for a G20, or rather, G20 will wither away or lose its relevance. So as we look forward to the latest G20 summit in South Korea next month, the number of skeptical voices have arisen, observing the chaos and the fractiousness of the G20 process and their inability to come to consensus on some of the most pressing contemporary questions. The ones that obviously are in the news being things like imbalances involving savings, consumer spending, predatory export promotion, etc., where the stated goal of a previous summit has not yet been realized, and we're still looking for answers to the G20 and whether it can create some kind of coordinated mechanism for redressing these imbalances, which are obviously at the root of the global crisis in the first place. So, the short view is that the G20 will not be needed, or rather, it will fall away, especially once we have sustained rebound or recovery from the depths of the crisis. And the two-paced nature of the recovery, especially the divide between the large emerging economies as vis-a-vis the old OECD advanced economies is clear, and we see increasingly patterns of disunity and breakdown of consensus within the G20 along these lines between those who believe that they probably don't need a coordinated response any longer, especially with some of these economies roaring again in the emerging world. So, the conclusion of the short view is that multilateralism in the form of the G20 will enter the same log jams that we have seen at the WTO and at climate change summits because of the rise of the rest as opposed to the West, this being Farid Zakaria's memorable phrase that the history of the last decade has been one of the rise of the rest. So, Great Recession, quote unquote, will subside, rebound will happen, at least in the emerging economies, and these more confident and assertive emerging economies, which have a luxury of actually rejecting hot money inflows now, can, of course, always oppose proposals that are being channeled by the Western powers. So all this means that basically there's no multilateral consensus, no room for persuasion or collective action, and coming to even to the issue of regulation, G20's record is very patchy, as we know, and highly uncoordinated. If the UK tightens the screws, then the city of London can threat to migrate to Frankfurt. If the G20 goes after offshore havens in Switzerland or Liechtenstein, there's a threat of capital flight to Singapore. The Damocles' sword of bond market sentiment and investor anxiety hangs so heavily over state action that no matter how coordinated actions are visible at the G20 level, it seems like it lacks relevance because there is a power above that of intergovernmentalism operating in the sphere of the capitalist world system itself, which can deny, negate, or sometimes simply shrug off any regulatory mechanisms adopted by the G20. So, and I also want to mention for the fiasco with the proposal for creating a global Tobin tax on financial transactions, for example. All of these fell by the wayside and largely through disagreement. So what kind of governance are we seeing? Is this actually simply a crisis-fighting mechanism which had temporary utility, and are we actually in a new phase where it will be each for one's own in this inward-looking, uncertain framework for the global economy, where each is concerned about my jobs, my deficit, my chances of winning the next election, my campaign financing, my economy's competitiveness. So the trade-offs that we expect at a large or fairly large multilateral gathering with the G20 simply don't seem to be happening. And therefore, there's a lot of rhetoric that we're coming together to fight this crisis and that the crisis is not over, but on the other hand, we see that it's falling apart. The representative of Turkey, for example, recently questioned whether the G20 really had any potential to stem the international currency and trade wars that are looming on the horizon. The long view, going back to my story of creation, the long view is that the G20 will continue to be the most relevant intergovernmental institution in the economic sphere. And this confidence comes from the fact that there is a psychological need for a G20 because of structural changes, the same structural changes in economic power that I broached in the beginning. So, emerging economies, their share and footprint in the global economy has grown so much that they have to be in the tent of global economic management. They cannot be left out, or else the very legitimacy and longevity of the capitalist world system is at stake. So, the G20, now that I have gone through the list of its failures, we must also recognize the greatest success of this institution has been coordinated economic stimuluses by all the member countries. Right? So, institutionalization of neo-Keynesian state policy on a global scale, at least during the immediate breakout period of the crisis, could not have been achieved without the G20. So, I'm proposing that the long gap, the seemingly unending gap between neoliberalism and neo-Keynesianism was bridged by some degree of unison at the G20, especially in 2008-2009. Now, with the double-paced recovery and with Europe at the mercy of the so-called bond markets and the investor sentiment, we are seeing a renewed crisis with neo-Keynesianism itself, and whether it will continue to hold sway in the deficit-killing political move in many parts of the world. So, but let us recognize the stimuluses which some people claim saved the world from falling into the abyss were enabled only through coordinated policies at the G20. The capitalist world system was saved from the brink by the G20. There's no question about it. And whether the system will become more humane or remain in the chokehold of, in Matt Taibbi's famous phrase, financial vampire squids, is not a G20 question. The G20 cannot resolve eventually the question of whether the vampire squids will continue to rule economic processes and flows. The question is one of popular struggles, especially within states and transnational coalitions of, let's say, main streets of the world unite against those who monopolize public policy in the era of Reaganism and neoliberalism. So G20 is a reflection of the current domestic and international balances of power. The G20 is here to stay because of the changed power configurations. There's a theory called institutional stickiness that political scientists often use to explain institutions that outlive their original raison d'etre but continue to have some relevance or purpose, and they continue to generate resources and to affect policy. Classic example being NATO. What is the purpose of NATO today, and how is it different since the end of the Cold War? So institutions create their own bureaucracy, their own interests, and their own self-justifications to prolong themselves. So I don't see the G20 withering away as those who take the short view are advocating. But rather what we will see is an increasing challenge for the G20 to remain relevant, not only, as I said, because of internal disunity among these 20 major economies, but also because there's clamor for those who are left out. Remember, the original premise of the G20 was that it is far more representative. People come up with figures saying 80 to 90% of the global economy sits on these 20 chairs. Right? So it's pretty much the world. But then there are smaller states, weaker economies. Bulk of the United Nations members are not part of the G20. And we are seeing increasing variation within the global south between states that are upwardly mobile and are becoming more and more powerful, and who are, of course, already accommodated in the G20, vis-a-vis those who are stagnant or those who have been left behind by the globalization tidal wave. And so for them, the question is legitimacy and representativeness of G20 is not quite enough. If the G7 thought that G20 was going to be a masterstroke by appeasing those who had been clamoring for a seat at the table, ask the rest of the 172 who are not in the G20 and what they think about the legitimacy of this institution. Can emerging economies speak on behalf of the weakest and the poorest states? These are questions that remain unresolved. But I'll just conclude by saying that if I were to use Michael will be very familiar if I were to use an investor's phrase, I'm not shorting the G20. The G20 is here to stay. It will reinvent itself, largely because, as I said, it is a reflection of structures that have changed and is not just a fire engine that was created after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Thank you.